They laughed at the key. My own children, standing right there in a mahogany-paneled attorney's office, surrounded by stacks of documents that represented 40 years of my life's work. They pointed at the rusted key hanging from my neck and laughed. Not a polite chuckle, not an awkward smile quickly swallowed out of respect. A full, open-mouthed, shoulder-shaking laugh, the kind that fills a room so completely it seems to push all the air straight out of it. I just smiled. I wrapped my hand around that key, pressed it flat against my chest for one quiet moment, and I smiled back at all three of them, because I knew something they didn't. I had always known something they didn't, and I had been patient enough, for long enough, to wait for exactly the right moment to show them. Let me take you back to that morning. The attorney's office sat on the 14th floor of a downtown building, all glass and steel on the outside, all mahogany and polished quiet on the inside. The kind of office designed to make you feel that whatever was happening within those walls was permanent, official, irreversible. The bookshelves were lined with legal volumes whose spines had never once been opened, decorative, like so much else in that room. A crystal paperweight scattered small prisms of afternoon light across the walls, and the carpet was a deep, oppressive burgundy that swallowed sound and warmth in equal measure. I had dressed plainly that morning. A gray work jacket, clean but simple, the kind of coat a man wears when he has never needed his clothing to speak for him. No watch on my wrist, no ring on my finger. My wife, Caroline, had passed 3 winters before, and I still hadn't been able to bring myself to wear it again without her. I sat in the chair across from the attorney's desk and sat quietly, the way a man sits when he has already made complete peace with what is about to happen. Around me, my 3 children moved through the room as though they already owned it. In most ways that mattered that morning, they believed they did. Daniel, my eldest at 44, stood nearest the desk with his arms folded across an expensive blazer that probably cost more than my first truck. He had my eyes, dark and steady, but where my eyes have always rested, his have always calculated. Rachel, my daughter at 41, sat on the edge of the credenza with the distracted ease of a woman long settled into the certainty that everything was unfolding exactly as she planned. Derek, my youngest at 38, hovered near the far wall, his hand drifting periodically toward the phone in his jacket pocket, already half present somewhere else he considered more important. The attorney, a quiet, efficient man named Wells, moved through the final transfer documents without sentiment or ceremony. That suited me fine. I didn't need ceremony. I knew precisely what I was signing. 40 years of hard work, freight corridor land, a regional transport and logistics operation, depot leases, active contracts, rolling stock, all of it formally conveyed to my 3 children under the amended family trust. The fair market value placed on the package sat at just over $20 million. I picked up the pen, and I signed. I felt the shift in the room the instant the pen left the page, the collective exhale of 3 people who had been waiting a very long time for that particular morning. Daniel brought his hands together in one sharp, satisfied clap. Rachel uncrossed her legs. Derek's hand finally left his pocket empty. It was Rachel who noticed the key first. Her eyes dropped to my collar, narrowed slightly, and she asked about it in the tone people use when they are not genuinely curious. They are simply pointing at something they have already decided is beneath them. I told her it was nothing important. That was enough to bring the other 2 in close. Derek leaned forward to look, and I watched the slow grin spread across his face. The grin of a man who finds something amusing, precisely because he cannot imagine it mattering. He made a remark about it looking like scrap metal. Rachel laughed first, bright and careless. Daniel followed, because Daniel has never once allowed someone else to set the mood of a room without him. They laughed at a rusted key. My own children. I tucked it quietly back beneath my collar. I looked at each of them in turn and smiled, slow, easy, and deeply patient. Not one of them thought to wonder what it opened. I want to tell you that the change was gradual, that there was at least a decent interval of warmth before the cold set in, some transitional period where my children remembered, however briefly, that I was still their father and not simply an obstacle they had successfully navigated around. I want to tell you that, but the truth is that the shift began almost immediately, and within 90 days it was complete. The first sign was small enough that a less observant man might have dismissed it entirely. The phone calls that had previously come every few days, checking in, asking after my health, the kind of calls that felt performative even when I appreciated them, slowed to once a week, then once a fortnight, then stopped altogether without announcement or explanation. I would call and reach voicemail. I would leave a message in the measured, unhurried voice of a man who refuses to sound like he is begging for his own children's attention, and I would wait. Sometimes a reply came the following day, then 2 days later, then not at all. The monthly allowance was next. When we had structured the asset transfer, Daniel had presented the allowance arrangement with great ceremony. A generous monthly sum, he called it. More than enough for a man of my modest needs and simple lifestyle. He said it with the particular brand of condescension that very young wealthy people reserve for the old, as though my 40 years of building that wealth had somehow left me unqualified to assess whether an allowance was generous or not. I accepted it without argument. I had my reasons. 2 months after the signing, the deposit arrived short. Not dramatically short, just enough to test whether I would notice, or whether I would say something. I noticed. I said nothing. The following month it was shorter still, and the month after that, an automated notification arrived in my email informing me that my monthly transfer had been paused, pending a review of trust disbursement schedules. No phone call, no conversation, a notification. The kind of message you send to a utility company, not to the man whose signature had handed you $20 million. Then came the group chat. I am not a man who places a great deal of importance on digital communication. I came of age with handwritten letters and landline telephones, and I have never fully trusted the intimacy people perform on small glowing screens. But Caroline had started the family group chat years before she passed, and after she was gone, it became the one thread still connecting me to the daily texture of my children's lives. Photographs of grandchildren I rarely saw in person, updates about holidays and promotions, and minor domestic victories. I did not contribute much, but I read everything. It was, in its quiet way, the closest thing I had left to family. One morning I opened my phone and found the thread simply gone. Not archived. Removed. I had been taken out of the group without message or explanation, the digital equivalent of a door closed in a face. I sat with that for a long time. Not with anger. Anger was not what I felt. I felt something colder and more clarifying than anger. I felt certainty. The kind of certainty that settles into a man's chest like ballast and steadies him completely. But it was the house that finally showed me exactly who my children had become. My childhood home sat on the western edge of a quiet county road, surrounded by the same oak trees my father had planted along the fence line the year I was born. A white farmhouse with a wide front porch, a stone fireplace in the main room, and a root cellar out back, where my mother kept her preserves through every winter of my childhood. When Caroline and I had first spoken about the asset transfer, I had been explicit, precise and deliberate in a way I rarely needed to be, about one thing. That house was not part of the transfer. It was not a business asset. It was not a line item. It was the place where every important thing in my life had either begun or been shaped, and it was not for sale. I learned through a distant cousin, almost by accident, that the property had been quietly listed on the market 3 weeks earlier. No conversation, no warning. And sometime around that same week, through the same cousin, I heard what Daniel had said about me at a family dinner I had not been invited to. He had laughed, apparently it was quite funny to the table, and said that the rusted key was probably to a storage unit full of junk. I sat in my small rented room that evening, and I held that key in my palm for a long time. Then I made a phone call, just one, and I started making plans. The bank was not the kind of place my children would ever have thought to look. That was precisely why I had chosen it 22 years ago, and precisely why I had never once mentioned it to any of them in all the years since. It sat on the corner of a quiet block in a working-class neighborhood 3 towns over from where I had built my business. A modest 2-story brick building, with brass door handles worn smooth from decades of ordinary hands, pulling them open for ordinary reasons. No marble lobby, no revolving glass doors, No security desk staffed by men in matching blazers speaking into earpieces. Just a painted wooden sign above the entrance. A small parking lot with cracked asphalt. And the kind of unhurried silence that exists only in places where people still conduct their most important business, face to face and without hurry. I drove there on a Tuesday morning in early October, leaving before sunrise so that I would arrive when the doors first opened and the day was still clean and uncomplicated. I had not driven that particular route in almost 4 years, but my hands remembered every turn without needing to be told. 40 years of driving freight corridors across 3 states will do that to a man. The roads become part of you, the same way the key had become part of me, resting against my chest beneath my shirt collar, patient and still and waiting. I parked in the far corner of the lot the way I always had, a habit from my railroad days, when you learned early that a man who leaves himself a clear exit is a man who maintains his options. I sat in the car for a moment after cutting the engine. Not out of hesitation. I had not hesitated about any piece of this in weeks. I sat because I wanted to feel the full weight of the morning clearly and without distraction. The pale autumn light coming through the windshield. The smell of October through a slightly cracked window. The quiet certainty of a man who has been planning something long enough that the plan has become completely calm inside him. The bank opened at 8:30. I was at the door at 8:29. Inside, the lobby carried the particular smell of old financial institutions, paper and metal and something faintly like furniture polish, applied regularly to surfaces that haven't changed in 30 years. The teller windows had brass frames. The floor was a worn but clean linoleum in a pattern that had not been fashionable since the late 1970s. A single ceiling fan turned slowly overhead, more out of habit than necessity at that hour of the morning. The woman behind the nearest teller window was named Margaret. I knew this because Margaret had been working at this branch for at least 18 of the 22 years I had held my account here, and because she was the kind of bank employee who remembered the people she served, the way a good neighbor remembers the people on her street, not from a file or a screen, but from having simply paid attention over a long period of time. She looked up when I came through the door, and her expression moved through recognition to something warmer without any gap between them. She did not ask for my identification. She did not ask me to fill out a form, or take a number, or wait in a cordoned line. She simply looked at me with the quiet acknowledgement of someone who understood, from the particular way a person walks through a door, that they have come to do something that matters. She made a single phone call, spoke briefly, and then came around from behind her window and led me personally toward the back of the building and down a narrow staircase to the basement vault. The vault room was small and deliberately plain. Rows of steel deposit boxes lined 3 of the 4 walls from floor to ceiling, each one numbered in small stamped metal figures. The air was cooler down here, the dry, still coolness of a place insulated from weather and season and the passage of ordinary time. A single overhead light hummed faintly. Margaret stopped at box number 214. She inserted her key into the left cylinder, turned it, and then stepped back with the practiced discretion of someone who understands that what happens next is private. I reached beneath my collar, pulled the leather cord up and over my head, held the rusted key in my palm for just one moment, feeling its familiar weight, its rough, oxidized surface, the smooth, worn patches where my thumb had rested against it for more than 2 decades. Then I inserted it into the right cylinder, turned it, and pulled open the door. The box slid out from the wall with a sound like a slow, careful exhale, the soft metallic whisper of something that has been waiting in stillness for a very long time and is finally, deliberately, being opened. I carried it to the small table in the center of the room and set it down without rushing. Margaret had already gone back upstairs. It was just me and the hum of the overhead light and the cool, patient air of a room that kept secrets the way only truly indifferent places can. Not out of loyalty, but simply because no one had ever thought to ask. Inside the box, resting exactly where I had placed it 22 years ago, was a document sealed inside a clear protective sleeve. Beneath it, a plain white envelope. And beneath that, a folded letter on corporate letterhead that was considerably more recent than everything else in that box. crisp and white against the aged interior, the way a new thing always looks slightly aggressive when placed among old ones. I lifted the sealed document first. It was a deed. Specifically, it was the recorded mineral rights deed to a 340-acre parcel of land in the hill country of West Virginia, filed under an independent LLC I had established quietly and without fanfare in the spring of a year when my freight business was doing well. My children were still young enough to be uninterested in my financial decisions, and a retired geological surveyor I had befriended over years of shared railroad routes had pulled me aside over coffee one morning and told me, with the measured conviction of a man who chose his words carefully, that the subsurface composition of a particular stretch of West Virginia hill country was going to matter to someone very important someday. I trusted him, not blindly. I was never a blind trust kind of man. I did my own research, quietly and thoroughly, the way I approached everything. I drove out to the land twice before I made any decision. I walked it. I read the survey reports. I consulted independently with a mineral rights attorney, whose office was 3 states away, and who had no connection to anyone in my professional or personal life. And then I purchased the mineral rights through the LLC, filed everything correctly, paid the annual maintenance fees without fail for 22 consecutive years, and told absolutely no one. Not Daniel, not Rachel, not Derek, not Caroline. And that is the one part of this story that carries genuine pain for me, because Caroline and I kept very few things from each other across 43 years of marriage. But I had kept this, not out of secrecy between us, but because I had sensed, even in those early years, that the value of what I was holding depended entirely on the discipline of silence. Some things protect you precisely because they remain unknown. The moment you speak them aloud, they become negotiable. They become something other people can have opinions about, can pressure you about, can plan around. As long as only I knew, the deed remained completely and entirely mine. I held it in both hands in that quiet vault room and felt the particular satisfaction of a very long patience finally arriving at its moment. The geological surveyor had been right. He had been right in the way that careful, observant people are sometimes right about things the rest of the world is too busy or too distracted to notice. Quietly, completely, and years ahead of anyone else. The hill country parcel sat above a mineral deposit that a major mining conglomerate had spent the better part of a decade trying to access through various land acquisition channels. They had worked around my parcel, approached adjacent landowners, filed their own surveys, and eventually arrived, as I had always known they eventually would, at the unavoidable conclusion that what they needed was sitting inside my LLC. I set the deed down and picked up the folded letter. It was their 4th offer. I had received the first 3 through my LLC's registered agent and had acknowledged each one with a brief, courteous response, indicating that I was giving the matter careful consideration. 22 years of patience had taught me that the best negotiating position available to any person is genuine willingness to wait. Their first offer had been $11 million, their second, 16, their third, 23. The letter in my hand was their 4th, and, they specified in careful corporate language, their final offer, $28 million, cash, payable within 30 days of executed agreement. I folded the letter along its original crease and held it for a moment. Outside the vault, somewhere above me, the ordinary world continued its ordinary business. Tellers counting, customers waiting, the slow ceiling fan turning in the lobby. None of it had any idea what was sitting in a man's hands in the basement below. I placed the letter carefully into my jacket's inside pocket, returned the deed to its sleeve, the sleeve to the box, closed the box, locked it, removed my key. Then I went upstairs, thanked Margaret, walked back out through the brass-handled door, and sat in my car in the October morning light for exactly 3 minutes, after which I drove home and picked up the phone. There is a particular kind of freedom that comes with having nothing left to lose. I want to be precise about that, because I think most people misunderstand it. It is not the reckless freedom of desperation, the kind that makes men do foolish things in loud, visible ways. It is quieter than that, cleaner. It is the freedom of a man who has already absorbed the worst his circumstances can offer, who has sat with the full weight of his situation without flinching, and who has arrived on the other side of that stillness, knowing exactly, with complete and unambiguous clarity, what he is going to do next. I made the first call the same afternoon I returned from the bank. Not to my children, not to anyone in my existing professional circle, most of whom had drifted, over the years of my semi-retirement, into the orbit of my children's business interests rather than mine. I called a man named Arthur Gaines, a semi-retired attorney I had known for 30 years, a man who had drawn up my original LLC documents and who possessed, in equal measure, an exceptional legal mind and the rare personal quality of knowing how to keep his mouth completely shut. Arthur worked alone from a small office above a hardware store in a town 40 minutes from mine. He had no associates, no junior partners, no staff beyond a part-time bookkeeper who came in on Thursdays. He was, in every meaningful sense, invisible to anyone who didn't already know exactly where to find him. I told Arthur I needed two things handled simultaneously, with complete confidentiality between them, and with my name kept entirely out of all documentation until the precise moment I chose to introduce it. The first was straightforward. I instructed him to contact the mining conglomerate's legal representative and communicate my acceptance of their $28 million offer, subject to a standard 30-day closing timeline and a clean cash transfer. Arthur had reviewed their previous offers at my request. He knew the terms, knew the principles, knew exactly how to execute the acceptance without creating any traceable connection back to me personally. The LLC would handle all communication. My name would appear nowhere. The second matter required somewhat more creativity and considerably more patience to execute correctly. My childhood home, the white farmhouse on the county road, the oak trees along the fence line, my mother's root cellar, had been listed at a price that my children believed was beyond the reach of the kind of buyer they imagined might be interested in a rural property with no particular commercial value. They had priced it to maximize their return and minimize complications. They wanted a clean, quick sale to someone who would write a check and ask no questions. I intended to give them exactly that, just not from the direction they were expecting. Arthur established a second blind LLC, a completely separate entity from the one holding the mineral rights, with no documentable connection between them and no identifying information that could be traced back to me through any standard title or ownership search. The new LLC had a bland, forgettable name of the kind that blends invisibly into the background of any real estate transaction, the sort of name that sounds like a small regional investment group and invites no further examination. Through this LLC, Arthur submitted a full cash offer on the farmhouse, not above asking price. That would have attracted curiosity. Not below, which would have invited negotiation and delay. Exactly at asking price, accompanied by a proof of funds letter, a clean preliminary title commitment, and a proposed closing date that gave my children everything they wanted: speed, certainty, and the comfortable impression that they were dealing with an entirely unremarkable buyer. I was told later, through Arthur, that Daniel had approved the offer within the same afternoon it was submitted, that Rachel had called it a clean deal, that Derek had already begun discussing how to allocate the proceeds. I will admit something here. There was a moment, sitting in my small rented room that evening, with Arthur's confirmation on the table in front of me, when I felt something that was not quite satisfaction, and not quite sorrow, but lived somewhere in the quiet space between them. That farmhouse had been in my family for 60 years. My father had built the front porch railing with his own hands. My mother had planted the kitchen garden along the south wall. Caroline and I had stood on that porch on the evening of our wedding day because it was the place that felt most completely like home to us. And now I was purchasing it back from my own children through a company they couldn't see, with money they didn't know existed, in a transaction they believed was completely outside my reach. I picked up Arthur's confirmation letter, folded it, placed it next to the mining company's acceptance document in the inside pocket of my jacket. Then I sat back and began preparing for the next part. I have spent a great deal of my life around machinery: freight engines, rail couplings, hydraulic lifts, cargo systems built from 10,000 moving parts that had to work in precise coordination or not at all. And the thing that every good engineer understands: The thing they teach you early and the field reinforces constantly is that the most dangerous moment in any complex operation is not when things are going wrong, it is when everything appears to be going right. That is when attention relaxes. That is when people stop watching. That is when the quietly turning gear nobody bothered to monitor finally does what it has been building toward all along. I dressed carefully the morning I went to see Daniel. Not in my best clothes, in my most strategically unremarkable ones. A slightly worn pair of trousers, a plain button shirt that had seen better days, shoes that were clean but carried the scuffed, tired look of a man who had stopped paying close attention to such things. I moved through the preparation with the same deliberate care I had given to every other element of what I was building, because I understood that the performance I was about to give was as important as any legal document Arthur was filing on my behalf. Perhaps more important, because documents work on paper, but what I needed to work on was something considerably more difficult: the absolute, unquestioning certainty in my son's mind that his father was finished. Daniel's office was in a building that had previously housed one of my freight depot administrative operations. He had renovated it thoroughly after the transfer. New facade, new interior, new signage bearing his name prominently above the entrance in the kind of large, authoritative lettering that announces a man who needs the world to know he has arrived. I noticed, walking through the lobby, that there was not a single photograph from the company's history on any wall. 40 years of operations, contracts, relationships, and hard-won corridors of business, all of it painted over and replaced with the clean, featureless aesthetic of a man who wanted no visible reminder that any of it had existed before him. He kept me waiting for 11 minutes. I know because I counted, not with irritation, with interest. The waiting was information. A man who makes his elderly father sit alone in a lobby for 11 minutes without acknowledgement has already told you everything you need to know about the precise nature of his regard. When I was finally shown in, I made sure my entrance was soft, slightly slow. I sat in the chair across from his desk, the way a much older, much more diminished man might sit, carefully, with the particular caution of someone whose body has begun to feel unreliable. I let my hands rest in my lap with their palms slightly upward, open, the unconscious posture of a person who no longer expects to hold very much. Daniel watched me from behind his desk with an expression I recognized immediately, and found, in that moment, almost useful. The specific mixture of impatience and pity that people wear when they are in the presence of someone they have already fully categorized, and therefore no longer need to pay very careful attention to. I told him, in a voice kept deliberately soft and slightly uncertain, that I had been finding the reduced allowance difficult to manage, that a few unexpected expenses had come up, that I was not looking for anything extraordinary, just a modest restoration of what had originally been agreed, enough to cover my basic needs comfortably. I let my sentences trail off at the ends the way tired people do. I looked at the desk between us rather than at his face. He told me the family finances were under significant pressure, that the business transition had brought unexpected costs, that selling the farmhouse, while he understood it was difficult for me emotionally, was simply responsible asset management, the kind of hard decision that adults sometimes had to make on behalf of people who were no longer in a position to make them effectively themselves. He said this with the smooth, practiced patience of a man delivering a verdict he had already decided was both correct and final. I nodded slowly, let my shoulders settle slightly, thanked him for his time, in a voice kept deliberately smaller than my own. And then I gathered myself with the careful, effortful movements of a man whose best years were clearly well behind him, and I made my way back through the lobby, past the walls with no history on them, and out through the front door into the open air. I sat in my car and allowed myself exactly 1 moment of complete stillness. Then I called Arthur and told him we were ready to set the closing date. The closing was scheduled for a Thursday morning at 10 o'clock in the offices of a real estate firm that Daniel had selected himself. A sleek, modern practice on the second floor of a building that was all clean lines and floor-to-ceiling glass. The kind of space that was designed to make transactions feel significant and inevitable simultaneously. I knew the address because Arthur had relayed it to me through the LLC correspondence. I knew the conference room layout because I had quietly visited the building the previous week on an unrelated pretext, walking through the lobby with the unhurried, invisible ease of an old man who appears to have arrived at the wrong floor and is simply reorienting himself. I dressed that morning the way I had dressed for every important moment in my professional life. A dark suit, not fashionable, not expensive by any measure my children would recognize, but well-made and well-maintained in the way that only genuinely old quality sustains itself across decades. My shoes were polished. My collar was straight. I stood at the mirror in my small rented room for a moment before leaving and looked at the man looking back at me, 72 years old, gray at the temples, with calloused hands and a long scar across the back of his right hand, and 40 years of freight corridors in his posture. And I felt something I had not felt in a very long time. Not triumph, not anger, something quieter and more permanent than either. I felt like myself, completely, unambiguously, without performance or concealment. Myself. I arrived at the building at 9:55. I did not go up immediately. I stood across the street for a few minutes in the October morning and watched the entrance until I saw Daniel arrive, followed shortly by Rachel and then Derek, all three of them moving through the glass doors with the loose, comfortable energy of people who are about to complete a transaction they consider uncomplicated. Daniel was laughing at something on his phone. Rachel was talking. Derek held a coffee cup in each hand, which meant he had bought one for someone he wanted to impress, and had probably not considered whether that person took milk. I waited until 9:59. Then I crossed the street, entered the building, and took the elevator to the second floor. The conference room was visible through a glass interior wall as I came off the elevator. A long table of pale wood, chairs in a neutral gray fabric, a sideboard with water and coffee along one wall. My three children sat on the far side of the table, with the relaxed, proprietary comfort of people who have decided that the pleasant part of the morning is very nearly upon them. The real estate attorney, a woman named Holloway whom Arthur had briefed thoroughly, sat at the head of the table with her documents arranged in front of her, and her expression composed in the careful, neutral professionalism of someone who knew exactly what was about to happen, and had decided that her primary responsibility was to the integrity of the process rather than the management of anyone's feelings. There was a chair at the near end of the table, the end facing my children across the length of the pale wood, that was conspicuously empty. The chair designated for the representative of the purchasing LLC. I opened the conference room door and walked in. I watched the moment land on each of them at slightly different speeds, the way a wave reaches a shoreline unevenly depending on the contour of the ground beneath it. Derek saw me first, and his coffee cup paused halfway to his mouth. Rachel's sentence, whatever she had been saying, simply stopped, cleanly and without conclusion, the way a power line cuts when something severs it. Daniel's reaction was the slowest and, because of that, the most complete. I watched understanding arrive in his eyes in stages, each one darker than the last, as the architecture of what he was looking at assembled itself into a shape he could not immediately accept. I did not rush. I walked to the empty chair at the head of the table, set my jacket straight, and sat down with the unhurried ease of a man who is exactly where he intended to be. I reached into my jacket and placed one item on the table in front of me. Not a document, not a phone. The rusted key, laid flat on the pale wood surface, quietly, where all three of them could see it. Then I looked at my children and waited for the attorney to begin. Attorney Holloway began with the documents, the way attorneys always do, methodically, without theater, moving through the formal elements of the transaction, with the steady, unhurried efficiency of someone who understands that the weight of a legal proceeding is carried most effectively, not through drama, but through precision. She confirmed the property details, the purchase price, the identity of the purchasing entity, and then, at the point in the proceedings where the identity of the LLC's principal owner is required to be formally disclosed for the record, she looked across the table at my three children and stated my name clearly and without preamble. The silence that followed was the kind that has texture, the kind you can feel pressing against the walls of a room. Daniel was the first to speak. He said my name, not as a greeting, not as a question exactly, but in the flattened, slightly disconnected tone of a man reading a word in a foreign language that he recognizes but cannot immediately place in context. Rachel looked between me and the attorney and then back at me, her expression cycling rapidly through confusion, calculation, and something that might, in a less composed person, have resolved itself into fear. Derek simply stared. I let the silence hold for a moment longer than was comfortable. Then I spoke, not loudly, not with any performance of triumph, in the same measured, level voice I had used in freight yards and contract negotiations and every important conversation of my professional life. I told them that the purchase had been funded through the proceeds of a mineral rights sale, conducted through a separate LLC I had maintained privately for 22 years, to a mining conglomerate whose offer I had finally accepted at $28 million cash. I told them the sale had closed cleanly, the funds had transferred without complication, and that the farmhouse, my father's farmhouse, my mother's farmhouse, the place where Caroline and I had stood on our wedding evening, now belonged to me again, purchased at full asking price, with money that had existed quietly and entirely outside the boundaries of anything they had thought they knew about my financial situation. I watched this information move through each of them differently. Derek's hand found the edge of the table and rested there. Rachel set down the pen she had been holding. Daniel's jaw tightened by a degree that most people would not have noticed. But I have been reading my eldest son's face for 44 years, and I noticed it precisely. Then I reached back into my jacket and produced the second document. Arthur had prepared it with characteristic thoroughness, clean, formally structured, every clause referenced against the original transfer agreement, with the kind of meticulous cross-documentation that is specifically designed to leave no interpretive room whatsoever. I slid it across the pale wood table and gave them a moment to look at the heading before I explained it. The original asset transfer agreement. The same documents they had watched me sign in the mahogany-paneled office. The same documents Daniel had presented with such ceremony and such confident finality, had contained, on page 31, in the subsection governing ongoing obligations to the transferring party, a maintenance and allowance clause. It was not hidden in the way that people use that word to mean deliberately obscured. It was present, clearly worded, and formally executed. It had simply been buried in the depth of a document that my children had been too eager, too certain of their advantage, and too fundamentally uninterested in the details to read with the attention it required. The clause was straightforward. In exchange for the transfer of $20 million in assets at below market rate for estate planning purposes, the receiving parties were legally obligated to maintain a monthly allowance to the transferring party, me, at the agreed amount, without interruption or unilateral reduction, for a minimum period of 10 years. Any breach of this obligation, including reduction, suspension, or failure to deliver the agreed amount without mutual written consent, triggered a clawback provision. The clawback carried a penalty of $600,000 in back allowances and damages, payable within 90 days of a formal breach notice. Or, in the alternative, a complete legal voiding of the entire asset transfer, returning all holdings to me in full. I had filed the formal breach notice through Arthur's office 11 days earlier. The 90-day clock was already running. I looked at my children across the length of the pale wood table, and I did not raise my voice, and I did not perform satisfaction, and I did not remind them of the laugh in the mahogany office, though I thought of it clearly in that moment. I simply told them that Arthur would be their point of contact for all correspondence going forward, that the 90-day window gave them sufficient time to seek their own legal counsel, and that I genuinely hoped they would use that time wisely. Then I picked up the rusted key from the table, closed my hand around it, and stood up. The farmhouse looked exactly as I remembered it, and nothing like it at the same time. That is the strange duality of returning to a place that has lived more completely in memory than in reality for a long stretch of years. The physical structure is faithfully, almost stubbornly present, every board and stone and fence post, exactly where it always was, and yet the emotional weight of standing before it again after so long makes it feel simultaneously familiar and new, like meeting someone you knew as a child and finding that the architecture of their face is unchanged but the person inside it has become something larger and more layered than the version you carried in your memory. My father's oak trees still lined the fence. The front porch railing he had built with his own hands still ran the length of the facade, weathered to a silver gray that was not there in my childhood, but suited the house entirely. The stone fireplace chimney rose from the roofline against an October sky that was the particular shade of pale blue that only appears in autumn, when the air has thinned and the light has changed its angle, and everything looks slightly more permanent than it did in summer. I moved my belongings in over 2 quiet days. I did not have many. A man who has spent the better part of a year in a small rented room accumulates very little. And I had always been, by temperament and by the practical sensibility of a railroad engineer, someone who traveled light. A few boxes of books, Caroline's photograph in its frame, my work tools neatly kept. The deed to the mineral rights, now transferred and completed, filed away in Arthur's safe for the record, and the rusted key, which I placed, the first evening, before I had unpacked anything else, on the stone mantelpiece above the fireplace, where it had always belonged. The calls from my children began the second day. Daniel called first, which I had expected, because Daniel has always believed that his voice carries more authority than the others, and that problems presented to him are best resolved by him speaking at them until they adjust. He was measured initially, controlled, professional, the tone of a man who has prepared his position in advance and intends to negotiate from it. He talked about the clawback clause in terms of its technical interpretation, suggesting that a reasonable reading of the agreement might find the breach ambiguous, that his legal team had identified several potential avenues of challenge, that surely there was a settlement arrangement that served everyone's interests without the need for formal proceedings. I listened without interrupting. When he finished, I told him that Arthur's contact information had already been provided, and that all correspondence regarding the legal matter should be directed there. Then I thanked him for calling and ended the conversation. Rachel called the following morning. Her approach was different, softer, more personal, reaching for the register of a daughter speaking to a father, rather than a party to a contract speaking to an opposing principal. She talked about family, about how none of this was what any of them had intended, about how things had moved faster than anyone had anticipated after the transfer, about how the reduced allowance had been a temporary administrative oversight rather than a deliberate act of disregard. She said she missed me. She said the children, my grandchildren, missed me. She let the statement sit in the air between us with the careful, practiced weight of someone who has identified the most effective emotional lever available and is applying it with deliberate precision. I told her I missed the children too. I told her that my door would always be open to my grandchildren, that no part of what was happening between their parents and me had anything to do with them, and that I hoped she understood the distinction between those two things clearly. Then I, again, referred her to Arthur. Derek did not call. He appeared. 2 days after I had moved in, I heard a car on the county road and looked out to see his vehicle pulling up the drive with the slightly too fast urgency of a man who has convinced himself that physical presence will accomplish what telephone calls could not. He knocked twice, sharply, the way he does everything, with an impatience that has always been his most consistent quality. I watched him from the front window for a moment. Then I went to the door. I did not open it. I told him, through the closed door, in a voice that was neither cold nor angry, but simply final, that the 90-day window remained open, that Arthur remained available, and that the matter was entirely in their hands. I heard him begin a sentence twice and abandon it both times. Then I heard his footsteps retreat across the porch, down the steps, and back to his car. I returned to the fireplace and looked at the rusted key on the mantelpiece for a long time. The storm came in from the west on a Friday night, the way the serious storms always do in that part of the country. Not suddenly, but with a long building inevitability that you can feel in the air for hours before the rain arrives. The sky darkened by degrees through the late afternoon, the wind picking up across the open fields and moving through the oak trees along the fence line with a low, continuous sound that the house absorbed and returned as a deep, settled quiet inside its walls. By 8 o'clock the rain was coming down in earnest, steady and cold and complete. The kind of rain that makes the world beyond the windows disappear entirely and reduces everything to the warmth and light of wherever you happen to be standing. I was sitting by the fireplace. I had built the fire earlier that evening from wood I had split myself that afternoon, not because I needed to prove anything by splitting it myself, but because the work felt right, felt continuous with something, felt like the proper physical grammar of a man returning to a place and resuming the life that place was built to hold. The fire had settled into a steady, generous burn by the time the storm arrived, and I had pulled Caroline's chair, the one with the slightly worn left armrest where she always rested her reading hand, close enough to feel the warmth of it fully, without being too near the heat. The rusted key sat on the mantelpiece above the fire. In the firelight it looked different than it did in ordinary light. The oxidized surface caught the flickering warmth and held it in a way that made the old metal look almost luminous, almost deliberate, as though the rust itself were a kind of finish rather than a kind of age. I had looked at that key in a great many different lights over the 22 years it had hung around my neck, and I do not think I had ever seen it look as completely at rest as it did on that mantelpiece, in that firelight, in the house where it had always belonged. I was not entirely surprised when I heard the knock. It came just after 9 o'clock, 3 sharp impacts against the front door, unevenly spaced in the way that suggests a person who has been standing outside, working up the resolve to knock, and has finally committed to it not from confidence, but from the exhaustion of standing in the rain. I sat with it for a moment before I moved. Not out of cruelty, I want to be clear about that. I have never, in any part of what I am telling you, been motivated by cruelty. What I sat with in that moment was something closer to the full acknowledgement of what I was about to face, and what it meant, and what it would cost me to handle it the way I had decided it needed to be handled. Because I knew, before I reached the door and looked through the side glass, that it was Daniel standing on my porch in the rain. He was not wearing a jacket. That detail struck me with a particular force. Daniel, who had always been the most composed of my 3 children, the most careful about presentation and appearance and the image of control, standing on his father's porch in a Friday night storm without a jacket, his shirt soaked through, his hair flattened against his forehead in the way that strips a person back to something more essential and more honest than their ordinary presentation allows. He looked, in that moment, less like the man who had stood in the mahogany office with his arms folded in triumph, and more like the boy I remembered from decades ago, uncertain, exposed, reaching for something he could not entirely articulate. I opened the door, not wide. I held it at a partial angle, enough to speak through clearly, enough to see him fully, but not open in the way that constitutes an invitation. He told me he needed help, not the family, him specifically, personally. The clawback penalty, combined with the legal costs his team had already accumulated, attempting to identify a challenge that Arthur's documentation had made effectively impossible to mount, had created a cash position that threatened the operational stability of the freight business in the short term. He was not, he said, asking me to forgive what had happened. He was asking me to consider that the consequences, as they were currently structured, extended beyond himself to employees, to contracts, to people who had nothing to do with any of the decisions that had brought us to this porch on this rainy night. I listened to all of it. I did not interrupt him once, and when he finished, I looked at my eldest son, this man I had held as an infant, taught to ride a bicycle on the county road at the end of this very driveway, watched grow into someone I had been proud of for a very long time before pride became something more complicated, and I spoke to him in the quietest, most deliberate voice I had used across this entire long episode of our lives together. I told him that I had not built 40 years of honest work to watch it become the instrument of my own humiliation. I told him that the allowance clause had not been a technicality or a trap. It had been a promise, a basic, human, contractual promise that he and his siblings had broken not out of financial necessity, but out of the simple belief that I was finished, and therefore no longer required the same consideration they would extend to anyone else they wished to keep on good terms with. I told him that the farmhouse had not been an asset. It had been a piece of my family's history, that they had sold without hesitation or remorse the moment it became convenient to do so, and that the ease with which they had done it had told me everything I needed to know about the values that had ultimately taken root in the space where I had hoped to leave something better. I told him that the 90-day window was still open, that Arthur was still available, that the terms remained exactly what they had always been, and that meeting them was entirely within their collective means if they chose to prioritize correctly. And I told him that I genuinely, without performance and without reservation, hoped that they would, not for my sake, but for their own, because the people we become in the moments when we believe no one is watching, or no one can stop us, are the people we have to continue being long after the moment has passed. Then I told him to go home, get dry, sleep, and call Arthur in the morning. I held his gaze for one long moment, and then I closed the door, turned the deadbolt with a single, clean, definitive click that I felt more than heard, the sound of a boundary drawn not in anger but in the absolute, settled authority of a man who knows precisely where he stands and has stopped apologizing for it. I walked back to Caroline's chair, sat down, looked at the rusted key on the mantelpiece, glowing quietly in the firelight above the warmth of my father's stone hearth, in my father's house, on a Friday night, with the rain coming down steady and cold outside every window. And I want to leave you with this, because I think it is the only thing worth saying when all the legal documents and the mineral deeds and the closing tables have been accounted for and set aside. A man's legacy is not the assets he accumulates across a lifetime of hard work. It is not the land, not the freight corridors, not the contracts or the holdings, or the fair market valuations placed on 40 years of honest effort by attorneys in mahogany offices. Those things are real, and they matter, and I am not pretending otherwise. But they are not the legacy. The legacy is what you teach the people you love about how to treat the people they love. It is the standard you hold yourself to when holding it costs you something. It is the patience you maintain when patience is the hardest available choice. It is the key you keep close to your chest for 22 years, not because you are planning revenge, but because you have always understood, at the deepest and most practical level of your being, that the truest form of security a person can possess is the thing that remains entirely and completely their own, known to no one, owed to no one, dependent on no one's continued goodwill for its value or its existence. They laughed at the key, my own children. I smiled, tucked it back beneath my collar, and I waited. If this story moved you, if it reminded you of something true about patience and dignity, and the long, quiet arc of a life lived with integrity, share it with someone who needs to hear it today. And if you are new here, there are more stories like this one waiting for you. Every one of them about ordinary people who held on long enough to be extraordinary. I will see you in the next one.